Hello and welcome to week 30 of Beloved Blackness. 30 weeks, y'all. 30 weeks. So, I want to talk today about almost like why we need Beloved Blackness. Not just this vlog per se, but kind of the impetus for even the need to marinate in, reflect upon, bask in our belovedness as people of African descent. And I want to think about it from the lens of trauma and the impact of the trauma of the Ma'afa. That one of the psychological impacts of psychic terrorism and creating a system that inherently placed the oppressed in a position of your physical survival being in the hands of the oppressor. You remember Dr. Linda James Meyer's first stage or phase of the psychology of oppression. The physical survival of the oppressed survival is in the hands of the oppressor through both terrorization and dehumanization. So that's the physical piece. And then we talked about the next phases in terms of being disconnected from your history and then having your history and culture negated and then having the elevation of the enslaver or the oppressor's history and cultural traditions as if yours didn't even exist. Okay. So I want to talk about those first four phases, not really get into the fifth phase. But talk about those first four phases and the impact of that psychologically upon us. So one of the impacts, maybe just hone in on one particular impact, but one of the impacts is then if your survival is contingent upon the oppressor, even when that survival develops out of a system of dehumanization, degradation, terrorization, there is an attachment to the perpetrator, to the oppressor. And there's an understandable attachment that's needed in order for you to figure out how to remain safe. Okay, so part of that attachment comes out of, okay, I got to figure out the oppressor in order to keep myself, my family, my community alive. And that's adaptive and that's wholesome. And we cannot stay there. We cannot have our survival, our physical survival, or our psychological survival, our spiritual survival, or our relational survival be in relationship to those who are supported by a system that oppresses us and that does not hold our well-being in mind. All right. So I'm not talking about individual relationships. I'm talking about our psychological connection to who and what the dominant group, whiteness, white people represent, okay, and our relationship with the people who represent whiteness or who are white identified, our psychological relationship to them and to the group as a whole and to the system that supports whiteness cannot be one that is that keeps us secure. That it cannot create a cohesive sense of ourselves, right? Because it's in reaction to, in response to trauma. That trauma leaves us in the place of trying to figure out how to survive. We are worthy and deserving of more than just survival. We are worthy of thriving. We are worthy of knowing who we were created to be outside of oppression, outside of white supremacy domination. We are worthy of having lives that reflect the dignity and worth and value that God created us for. And so part of our journey and what I hope through Beloved Blackness is for us to start to identify, how am I anchored outside of whiteness? How am I anchored outside of white supremacy domination? It doesn't mean to live in a bubble of denial that those systems and the way of being in the world that supports whiteness we will be impacted by it. However, our lives and our response and our relationship to it will come from a different place the more we're connected to our own sense of value, our own sense of worth outside of whiteness. And so I implore you over this next week to think about, how is my sense of myself attached to whiteness? How is it attached to what white people think about me? How is it attached to my response and reaction to whiteness and whiteness's stance of anti-blackness? And when you start to think about those things, think about ways that you can anchor in, get detached from your identity solely being connected today. It's not going to be a all or nothing way of being in the world, right? That it's a process to get disentangled from the impact of the perpetrator or the oppressor, right? Anytime we've been in traumatic relationships, it takes time to get untangled from it. So it's the same way as it relates to our cultural selves. And then to anchor in, what are some ways in which that I've talked about over the past 29 weeks that you can begin to see your light within your cultural identity to hold you up that's separate from white supremacy domination. All right, until next week.